definitionally, it's not apartheid, because apartheid would have to be racial segregation within the state.
What is Israel doing there? That's the question. On what basis are Israeli soldiers...
How do you have pro-Palestinians voting for Trump? Are they hypocrites?
Jake, occupations are supposed to be temporary under international law. It's a temporary situation.
Iran is said to back groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I mean, do you think that helps or hurts the Palestinian cause?
A Palestinian in the West Bank cannot go anywhere else in the world without going through an Israeli border check.
All right, Omar Baddar, thank you so much for connecting today.
Of course, happy to be with you, Jake.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let's dive right in. With Syria and Assad's collapse, how is that going to affect Israel and Palestine, do you think? How is that going to shift the regional dynamics for both Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, it's a little early to know what the long-term consequence of all of this is. Obviously, in the short term, I think Israel sees this as a benefit. They always saw the Assad government as kind of an extension of the sphere of influence for Iran. The way Iran gets weapons to Hezbollah is through Syria. And now that you have that government falling apart and the opposition coming in, it seems like that is a lot less likely to continue. But the forces that will take control of Syria, that still remains uncertain. I think that there is a couple of things happening in Syria. One, there is the risk of kind of violent, sectarian, religious fundamentalists taking power. That, I think, is primarily a threat to Syrians themselves, to religious diversity in Syria and so on. And by extension, it might be a threat to many other people in the region as well. The other factor is the external regional pressure on Syria to play a specific role. Given the countries that have the most influence over the opposition right now, there is an effort to make sure that Syria essentially abandons the Palestinians, that Syria becomes, abandons the Golan Heights too, for that matter, and just accepts Israel's annexation of them, as Israel is repeatedly making clear. Those are both regressive forces that Syrians have a challenge to overcome. If they do successfully overcome them and Syria turns into a legitimate democracy that represents its people, I think both of these things are not going to be a factor. The Syrian people are in deep solidarity with Palestinians, and they want to live in a pluralistic, democratic society. And so I'm pulling for the Syrians themselves to win. And if Syrians were themselves indeed to win and for that country to be a democracy that represents its people, I think that there will be nothing for Israel to gain. But it's premature to talk about what is going to take place exactly, because obviously the amount of pressure from the US, from Israel, from Turkey, from everybody else in that neighborhood trying to influence the regional position that Syria takes is going to determine the future. But in the meantime, Israel is not taking any chances. Regardless of what specific shape Syria takes, they want to make sure that Syria is weak and in no position to pose any threat to Israel. And so they've gone ahead and invaded deeper into the country. Of course, Israel is already an occupying force in the Golan Heights. Now they've expanded that occupation a little bit deeper. And they're carrying out this massive campaign that is just utterly unjustified by any stretch of the imagination, on the grounds that Syria, that Israel feels has a legitimate security threat, is what you keep hearing from Western officials. Well, a lot of countries have legitimate security concerns about other countries. That does not give you the right to go ahead and invade and start bombing recklessly and destroying the entire military infrastructure and bombing in cities and so on to facilitate your control of that country. That is mind-boggling that we operate in a media climate where that's not adequately challenged. And all you have to do, Jake, is imagine the opposite scenario. Frankly, Iran has a legitimate security threat when it comes to Israel. Israel constantly threatens to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, allegedly to prevent the possibility of a nuclear weapons program and so on. If Iran were to decide that based on this threat, they're going to level the entire Israeli Navy, frankly, nobody would say, well, they have legitimate security concerns. Everybody would see this as a declaration of war, would see this as an act of aggression, and would demand something be done about it. But we operate in this environment in which Israel is a country that is above the law and above any rules, and whatever they think is in their interest, they get to just go ahead and carry out and do, regardless of where, when, and how. And that's, I think, a deep problem in the way that we look at issues.
I mean, there would definitely be repercussions if Iran tried to take out Israel's Navy, for example, right?
Yeah, look, in terms of direct consequences from the parties is one thing, but there's the way that we talk about it. And I think that we here in the United States almost are obsessed with Israel's right to self-defense. Everything Israel does, it's always about what's good for Israel, what's in Israel's interest, what's in Israel's security. and nobody else's security or self-defense ever factors in. You never hear Palestinians' right to self-defense or Syrians' right to self-defense or Iran's right to self-defense. That's just never part of the conversation when it comes to American politicians and the American media.
And what about Hezbollah? What about in Lebanon? I mean, do you think the ceasefire with Hezbollah is going to stick? Is it a signal of hope for a broader truce, maybe even with Gaza, or is it just a false sense of stability, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to stick. It's kind of interesting that what you have between Hezbollah and Israel is a repeat of the 2006 war. And it's funny, I know that people have different reviews of these. Both the 2006 war and the 2024 war are both wars that were fought to a stalemate, and they looked very similar. And the primary difference is expectations going into that war is the reason why people refer to the first one as a Hezbollah victory and the second one as an Israeli victory. But just in 2006, everybody expected Israel to be able to go there and just obliterate Hezbollah. And instead, what happened is that even though the destruction and devastation in Lebanon was far greater, ultimately Israel was not able to stop the rocket fire out of Lebanon. And when they sent their troops and tanks on the ground, they suffered significant casualties. And ultimately, Israel was forced to accept a ceasefire without achieving its military objectives. And so everybody saw this as a Hezbollah victory against the odds. And you fast forward to 2024, and all that happened is that the expectation was the opposite. Hezbollah was promising that this is not going to be a repeat of 2006. While they know they have the upper hand should Israel invade on the ground, they said that whatever destruction the Israeli Air Force carries out, Hezbollah is going to meet building for building in Israel as well with their rocket fire. And when they were not able to do that, when Israel's intelligence penetration of Hezbollah was so significant that they flattened the entire leadership before the war even began and then launched that war, made it so that Hezbollah could not essentially keep that promise, the threat to meet equal devastation in Israel as there is in Lebanon. But it still ended exactly the same way. More devastation in Lebanon. Israel invades. They can't stop the rocket fire. The rocket fire continues into the last day of that exchange. And Israel was suffering significant casualties on the ground in Lebanon. And ultimately, they were forced to accept a ceasefire. But this is a fight that is not ended. It is only going to restart. And the only question is when. Is it going to take well over a decade as it did last time? Or is it going to rekindle again within weeks or months is what remains to be seen. But I think that there is no hope of kind of a long-lasting peace between Lebanon and Israel with the current status quo.
Does that change with Trump coming in? I mean, Trump's promised peace for Gaza. Do you take that seriously? I mean, what's your view on whether U.S. policy can address Palestinian aspirations and maintain support for Israel? Or what's your view on how the Trump administration is going to impact all this? I'm guessing you're not a Trump fan.
I'm not, yeah.
No, you're
and
not.
It's
I've met a lot of pro-Palestinians who are somehow.
which is surprising a little bit, but I get it.
What do you make of that? What do you make of the fact there's a lot of? I mean, have you seen that or no?
I have here and there, and I think
What do you make of that?
Partly disappointment with the way the Biden administration has behaved over the past year and a half has been absolutely atrocious to allow the scale of violence that, again, at this point, I think that the debate is shrinking on whether this is a genocide or not. Just the sheer number of credible people who are experts on this topic who are saying this is absolutely genocide. Amnesty International, the world's largest human rights organization, coming out and saying this is genocide.
Well,
and
Trump has less empathy for Palestinians than Biden. That's for sure.
I know. It's incredible, right? So here's what's happening. This the reason why this is.
How do you have pro-Palestinians voting for Trump? Are they hypocrites?
I think they are misunderstanding what Trump brings to the table. I think they're looking at the disappointment they have in somebody who has enabled genocide for the past year and a half and saying you cannot reward that with a vote for the Democratic Party. A lot of people stayed home entirely, didn't vote. A lot of them voted third party to register their objections. And then some people bought into Trump's rhetoric, which I don't take at face value.
But Trump's rhetoric says that he doesn't care about Palestinians. Like, that's part of his rhetoric.
It is. And at the same time, also part of his rhetoric is he doesn't want war in the Middle East and wants to calm everything down. So he kind of like talks out of both sides of his mouth to make everybody happy. He's a more effective liar. Honestly, if you want me to put my finger on it, Trump is a more effective liar that even though both Biden and Trump are equally insincere about wanting what's best for Palestinians, Trump sells it better. He just comes across as authentic, even though his record shows that he's utterly dishonest through and through. And as you mentioned, also expresses a lot of deep antipathy towards Palestinians, uses the word Palestinian as a slur. But here's what I want to point to that I think is a little bit paradoxical and people don't pay enough attention to. Biden is deeply personally committed to Israel. And Trump does not give a shit about Israel, doesn't give a shit about Palestinians. Trump doesn't care about absolutely anyone except himself. It just so happens that what's good for him is to be supportive of Israel and to also be supportive of a ceasefire at the same time. So I think that Trump is actually serious about wanting to see a ceasefire in Gaza. But his idea and his terms for what that ceasefire is, the idea that he's going to support Palestinian aspirations for freedom or statehood or equality or any of that stuff, I think that's completely bonkers to imagine anything like that. You look at the group of extremists that Trump has surrounded himself with. It is obvious that policy is going to be essentially an endorsement of Israel's intention to annex the West Bank, to ethnically cleanse North Gaza, to seize more land and empty less Palestinians. That's been the project from day one for Israel, is to maximize the amount of land they're taking and minimize the amount of Palestinians on it. And Trump is going to be essentially an endorser of that project. Previous Democratic Party presidents have basically said, we're going to support Israel no matter what they do, but we urge and we condemn and all of that. And with Trump, there isn't any of that. He just said in his last term, settlements are not illegal in violation of international law. Jerusalem is Israel's capital in violation of international law. Israel's takeover of the Golan Heights in Syria, which is also illegal. Trump endorsed it. So you see that Trump is willing to go all in on Israel's expansionist policies and giving them their wish list. But at the same time, I think in this case, because for his own reputation, he wants to be the guy who ended the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, he might be actually applying some pressure to try to get a ceasefire into play. But that's not going to translate to a better future for Palestinians.
So what do you think the result's going to be? Maybe a ceasefire, but maybe more suffering.
I think ceasefire, we're closer to it. It's still, right, we're stuck in this dynamic where Hamas is saying ceasefire means Israel has to leave Gaza. They're willing to give up all the hostages. They make clear, we're willing to give up all the hostages. We just need this war to end and for Israel to leave Gaza. And the sticking point is Israel has no intention of leaving Gaza. They are, for them, frankly, I'll go even a step further and say Netanyahu does not want the hostages to be released, because then he would not have the excuse to carry out in Gaza what he's currently doing, which is just obliterating significant portions of the population. His own framing was to thin the population down to a minimum in Gaza. That was a quote of him speaking to Ron Dermer that leaked in the Israeli press. And I think that that's what they're trying to do. And they don't really care about the hostages that much. They think it's a small sacrifice compared to fundamentally changing the reality in Gaza so that Israel can be in even tighter control of that area with less significant Palestinian population and therefore less a concern for them.
And what do you make of the fact that Iran is said to back groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad? I mean, do you think that helps or hurts the Palestinian cause?
Well, the Palestinians are abandoned by practically everyone. There's a lot of rhetoric out there about solidarity with Palestinians. A lot of governments in the region that are allied with the US will talk a big game about how Palestinian rights are important and we condemn what Israel is doing to them. But when push comes to shove, all these countries are not lifting a finger to meaningfully change the situation for Palestinians. And more than that, they have diplomatic relations with Israel, they have economic relations with Israel, and they've never even threatened to put these kinds of relationships on hold in exchange for Palestinians being treated better. So in that sense, Palestinians are abandoned, and that's where Iran sees an opportunity in a cause that is popular with people in the region, but not governments in the region, solidarity with Palestinians. Iran sees that this is one way they can spread their influence. They see the frustration throughout the region with people who don't like the fact that their governments are not doing anything to help Palestinians. And Iran is coming along and saying, we're the only ones who are in real solidarity with Palestinians. We're the ones sending weapons. We're the ones who have an antagonistic relationship with Israel. And that's sort of been Iran's attempt at spreading its influence in the region, using the Palestinian issue because they know it's an issue of deep frustration. So in that sense, is it good or bad for Palestinians? I don't think it's the balance of power between Israel and the Palestinians is so significant. I don't think that that's going to be decisive one way or the other, but it's clearly a reflection of the deep frustration with the fact that everybody has abandoned Palestinians.
And to what extent do you put any onus, responsibility, or blame on Palestinians? Like I hear one narrative from pro-Palestinian people that it's Israel, it's entirely their fault, and I've heard the other narrative from pro-Israelis that everything Israel is doing is just in response to terrorism. Where do you stand? I mean, let's just say, for argument's sake, that Israel is the oppressive power. They've done the blockade. They're creating dire situations in Gaza and historically, and the counterpoint to that is that a lot of what they've done for security has been in response to terrorism. So it doesn't diminish the Palestinian cause to put some amount of blame or responsibility on bad actors. We can condemn terrorists, for example, and say, yeah, like October 7th was bad, right?
Mhm.
Right. So that doesn't take away from the Palestinian cause. So what amount of like responsibility do you put on whether it's the government or people in Palestine to say, listen, you guys have been oppressed, but you've done some bad things, and Israel has reacted or overreacted to those things, but it doesn't make the Palestinians or Hamas or whoever guiltless in
Yeah.
this situation.
I think the correct way to frame this is literally to compare it to almost any situation of oppression in history. South Africa is low-hanging fruit because apartheid is I think prior to this genocide is a pretty close approximation, where we can recognize that the ANC committed acts of terrorism and hurt white civilians and killed white civilians in South Africa, and that is morally wrong. You should never kill civilians. But when it comes to the question of blame about the situation we find ourselves in, the blame is 100% on the apartheid government. That is the underlying cause of the conflict. So yes, we can acknowledge that Palestinians have committed acts that are morally wrong and indefensible in the course of this conflict. But when we talk about responsibility for the conflict, that is absolutely the onus is on the oppressor party, the driving force of this conflict, the occupiers, who are creating a situation in which violence is inevitable. No justice, no peace is not just a slogan to shout at a protest. It is a fundamental description of human nature. The problem is the injustice that is driving this conflict. And if you don't eliminate that injustice, you are going to end up with countless examples of individual Palestinians and individual Israelis doing things that are horrible to each other. Obviously, the scale of the atrocities by Israel is far greater because of that imbalance of power. But ultimately, it's about taking away that underlying cause. And the underlying cause here is the fact that Palestinians are denied freedom. There is no comparison between Palestinians and Israelis in their daily existence under this current system. Israelis are free. They can go to nightclubs. They can travel anywhere in the world. Palestinians live under occupation and the complete control of Israelis. And that inequality, that dynamic in which one side rules over the other is the reason we have a conflict. And so therefore...
Wait, but there's Israel and Palestine, right? So in Israel, you have Arab citizens, right? That are 20% of the population. Are you saying, like, if I want to follow this analogy, are the Arab citizens of Israel, the 20% of Israel's population, is that analogous to apartheid in South Africa?
So there are multiple... Really, when you look at the full Palestinian population between the river and the sea, you have it's a multi-tiered apartheid system. Palestinian citizens of Israel have it better off than most other Palestinians. They can participate in democratic rights, they can move around, they can vote, but there are still many laws within Israel that discriminate against them. Housing laws that discriminate against them, who they can marry. Yes.
Aren't there Knesset members that are Arab? And
yes, and those Knesset members who are Palestinian, of Palestinian origin, who serve in the Knesset, they bring a bill quite frequently to the Knesset demanding full equality. They want full equality and defining Israel as a state for all of its citizens instead of only its Jewish citizens. And every time they bring that bill forward so that they can say Israel is their country too, that's what they're asking the Knesset to recognize. And the Israeli Knesset keeps shooting it down. They don't even put it forward to a vote. When you look at the level of hostility towards those Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset, it's incredible. They're not allowed to do anything. Any push for genuine, real equality on their part gets dismissed and pushed out of the way. You have housing admissions committees in Israel that say that in order to live in a certain neighborhood, you have to be, quote, culturally suitable. And that's really very thinly veiled, description of the fact that they don't want Palestinians in Jewish neighborhoods. And when Palestinian citizens of Israel and their rights groups go and challenge these, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that these housing admissions committees are perfectly legitimate and defensible in a way that is completely antithetical to what happens here in the US. In the US, if you file a complaint that you were denied a house in a particular neighborhood because they did not find you, quote unquote, culturally suitable, you would sue for discrimination instantly. But that's not how it works in Israel.
Yeah.
And so there's an Israeli human rights organization called Adalah that represents Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they go through all of the laws within Israel that discriminate against Palestinian citizens. So they have it better than Palestinians in the occupied territories who have virtually no rights, but they're still not fully equal either. So it's a multi-tiered apartheid system where I would say that Palestinian citizens of Israel have it a little bit better than Black South Africans during the apartheid era, whereas Palestinians in the occupied territories possibly have it a little bit worse. So it evens out to being roughly
Okay.
saying that it's an.
Well, and I'm not trying to make like a blanket moral stance or claim about. There's plenty of problems in Israel. There's plenty of things that are going wrong that they could do better. And I when I'm picking apart like this nuance between South Africa and Israel, it's not to prove that Israel's in the right and Palestine's in the wrong. It's just that I think nuance is important. In the same way that you said that we should recognize that any act of terrorism against civilians is morally wrong, that nuance is important, even if you're representing the Palestinian cause. And likewise, I think the nuance of the history in this current situation is important, and I should be able to push, back on the analogy without necessarily saying whether I agree or disagree with what Israel's doing. I mean, in South Africa, it was a legal system of racial segregation, right? They didn't. So black South Africans didn't have voting rights.
Yeah, and Palestinians
in Israel, Arabs are 20% of the population. They have full voting rights. They have political representation. They have access to judiciary. There's plenty of things wrong in the society, but the analogy doesn't completely work. And the final thing I'll say is the situation in West Bank and Gaza is different because I'm not saying it's good morally, but it's territorial and security. Like West Bank and Gaza is not part of Israel. It's a territory dispute.
Yeah,
right?
It's not supposed to be part of Israel. But when you look at what Netanyahu is saying and what his ruling government is saying, they're saying Israel rules all of it, Judea and Samaria.
Those guys are bad guys, but that's not how.
Well, they're the bad guys in charge, though. They're not some fringe on the side. They're the people who are determining Israeli policy with the backing of the majority of the Israeli public. That's where the Israeli public is. And Israel, as a democracy for its Jewish citizens, is effectively endorsing this vision in which Israel has complete control over the West Bank. And within that West Bank, you have an Israeli settlement directly next to a Palestinian town. The Israeli settlement is ruled under Israeli law. They exercise Israeli democracy within that. They have access to water. They have access to free movement. And directly next to them in the same West Bank, a Palestinian town, Palestinians who live under it don't get to vote for the government that rules their lives, the Israeli government. They don't get to move in and out freely without Israeli controls. They don't get the same amount of water as their Israeli neighbors get. And so it is apartheid. It is absolutely a system of segregation.
Maybe it's a semantic thing. Omar, all I'm saying is if we're going to be like super pedantic and literal, like you and I know that West Bank and Gaza is not part of Israel. And so we can say it's genocide or whatever you want to call it. But definitionally, it's not apartheid because apartheid would have to be racial segregation within the state. I'm sorry to be pedantic, but like you mean, right?
It's Israel rules those areas. That's the part we're missing. You keep saying they're not, but Israel rules them, and that's the point.
Do they rule?
They absolutely rule the West Bank. I mean, if you look at the Amnesty International report, you look at the Human Rights Watch report, both of these major human rights organizations, one US-based, one England-based, they're the two largest human rights organizations in the world. They've both put out reports detailing how Israel is an apartheid state. Specifically, they say, though they don't use the term apartheid state, they say guilty of the crime of apartheid, that they are practicing apartheid against Palestinians. And it is absolutely based on that system of discrimination that they practice against Palestinians.
And sorry to come back to this, but I'll move on from this point, but how do you reconcile the fact that 20% of Israel's population are Arab citizens with full voting rights?
Yes, you reconcile it by saying that Israel has a multi-tiered apartheid system in which different categories of Palestinians have different levels of rights. And so, yes, Palestinian citizens of Israel have the most rights, and then the people in East Jerusalem have less, the people on the rest of the West Bank have less, and then the people of Gaza, they're just thrown in a cage, and Israel's thrown away the key. They have, just living in absolute squalor.
Wait, but and I'm sorry, I'm just slow, I guess. Aren't Gaza and West Bank, by anyone's definition, I know you're saying Israel has like kind of asserts control over them, but by definition, they're not part of Israel. Like by nobody's definition, except for
what is Israel doing there? That's the question. On what basis are Israeli soldiers patrolling the West?
It's not part of Israel. Like if you were in Gaza, you wouldn't say I'm in Israel, right?
I'm agreeing with you, but given the fact that Israel is exercising control over the occupied territories and has made it clear that they have no intention of ever relinquishing that control, this is an occupation. And within that occupation, they've imposed the rules of apartheid. What Israel is saying, Israel is not saying that Israelis who live in Israel get one treatment and Israelis who live in the West Bank get another. They're saying any Israeli who lives in the occupied West Bank has full rights, but any Palestinian living in the same West Bank has no rights. The difference
even though it's not their land, and again, like this might be a semantic thing, but even though it's not their land, we can call it apartheid because of the way they're treating them. But like if the U.S. went into Mexico and was invading Mexico and treating Mexicans badly, Would that
Mhm.
be apartheid?
If the US held on to Mexico for 50 years
What do you
and
mean
made it
held
absolutely
on? Like,
clear
what do you
that
mean
they
by
have,
held on? I'm saying like if they went in there and they blockaded them, and would that
yeah,
be?
yeah. Look,
Maybe it's a terminology.
Jake, occupations are supposed to be temporary under international law. It's a temporary situation. You're holding on to somebody else's land, but we're waiting to extricate ourselves as soon as possible. And what Israel did is build more and more and more illegal settlements in the West Bank because they want to hold on to it forever. So when we talk about occupation, that occupation is illegal. Israel's refusing to end it. They've held on to it for well over 50 years now, from the 1967 war until today. And all they've done is entrench their control of that area. A Palestinian in the West Bank cannot go anywhere else in the world without going through an Israeli border check. That tells you everything you need to know. Israel controls those areas, and Palestinians who live in the West Bank live under Israeli control. A 50-year-old Palestinian today in the West Bank has known nothing except Israeli authority over them. They have never been able to visit any other country without Israel allowing them to. And every time they've tried to come back home, Israelis search them on the way back in. Israel controls Palestinians in the occupied territories. That's the point.
They
That's
did
why it's
withdraw in
important to
2005, right?
withdrew settlers, but the occupation continued. And that's a point that I think is really important because it's a very, very easily accessible propaganda point. Israel keeps saying we left Gaza. All Israel did is withdrew settlers out of Gaza, but then put Gaza under complete control from the outside, the perimeter. And Palestinians still have no airport in Gaza. They can't fly in and out. They have no seaport. Their economy is completely dependent on what Israel allows them to trade in and out. Electricity is dependent on Israel. Their water is dependent on Israel. By no means is Gaza independent. So this pretense that Gaza was freed and that Israel let them be their own is simply a lie. Israel has always been in control and has deliberately wrecked the economy in Gaza for the intent purpose of putting political pressure on the people in Gaza to punish them effectively for having voted for Hamas. And that's if Palestinians had punished Israelis for voting for Netanyahu by putting Israel under siege and not letting them have an airport or a seaport or trade with the outside world, we would recognize what that is. But Israel gets to do it. And again, whenever Israeli aggression acts out, we always look at it from the Israeli perspective and say, well, it's understandable. They have concerns. They have this, they have that. Well, Palestinians have concerns too, and they have the right to self-defense as well. And the way Israel has treated them is just utterly unjustified under international law. And that's why every major human rights organization in the world has condemned it, including the blockade on Gaza, that even before this war has been described as illegal by every major human rights organization.
Okay, so you made a statement earlier that when we look at the situation and the bad things that the Palestinians are doing in terms of terrorism, we can look at them and call them morally wrong. But the gestalt of it, you're saying Israel's the cause. So my question is jihadism always a result of oppression? Like whenever terrorism or extremism arises? No, this is an honest question.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. Do we always say, well, that group is being oppressed and therefore that's why obviously someone whose life is going very well is probably not going to become an extremist jihadist, probably not. But does that mean that whenever someone does terrorism in the world or is a religious extremist that we is it necessarily the case that that person or group of people is being oppressed and that's the cause of it? Or can jihadism kind of arise for some other malevolent reason?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that descriptor jihadism because I think it plates some things together. I think if we, because one can from
terrorism,
let's talk about terrorism. I think that's fine. That's a fine frame to say.
Terrorism fueled by religious extremism. Call it whatever word you want, but that's kind of the core of what I'm getting at.
So I think the emphasis on the religious side of it is less important to me because to me, somebody whose violent reaction to oppression takes on a religious tone in one part of the world might take on a completely different tone and expression in a different part of the world. It's
9/11. We don't say, oh, it's the US's fault that they bombed the Twin Towers. No sane person would say that.
Yeah,
right?
No sane person would say that 9/11 is justified, and anybody who does is completely out of their mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And what I think is relevant is you brought up, I think what's relevant here is the fact that you brought up Palestinian citizens of Israel. Why do you think there's not a Hamas among Palestinian citizens of Israel? Why aren't Palestinian citizens of Israel picking up guns and bombs and carrying out October 7th style violence? Is it impossible for any Palestinian citizens of Israel to kind of become violent? Of course, it's not impossible. but certain conditions produce a propensity towards more extremist expression and acts. And I think that's the connection that matters, is that you're never going to be able to completely eliminate any individual from doing something crazy or violent. That's always a possibility in any context. But we know that situations of prolonged injustice absolutely drive people towards that thinking. That if you're a Palestinian growing up in Gaza, you have no better future, no prospect for a better future for your kids. Israel bombs you at will. They've carried out multiple military operations before October 7th, in which they've killed hundreds of children per operation. No ability to respond to that, no accountability for it. Nobody gives a shit about you. Your life is utter squalor. And so when somebody comes along and promotes a more extremist ideology, and a violent one, as the means towards liberation and a way to respond to this, that's going to be more appealing to people who live in that. So no, it is not always a situation, terrorism, the prerequisite to terrorism is not that you're living under oppression, but the opposite is true, that if you live under oppression for a prolonged period of time without any access to freedom or justice or equality or accountability, then that makes extremist ideologies more likely to flourish. And people.
But then what do you do as the Israel? Like, what would you expect the U.S. to do when they bomb the Twin Towers? Does the U.S. say, oh, well, we must have oppressed them, and then therefore they become extremists by that logic, like they were oppressed, and so they did this. And so what, like, ideally the U.S. wouldn't have like launched this full scale war, but like practically speaking, like this is kind of like the catch-22 part, is like, what do you expect? The U.S. is not going to say, oh, like, this is our fault. Like, what a good wake-up call.
Yeah,
right.
The correct thing to do is to hold the individuals who perpetrated whatever attack accountable, and then fixing your own policy and examining what you have done to create a world in which these kinds of things are more likely. And in the case of the US, it's a little bit complex when you talk about US empire and, the US military bases in the region and what the US has done in Iraq and stuff. These things are very loose. And you can't point to a very singular cause about what the problem is exactly and how the US can behave better. That's a complex topic that we can get into. In the case of Israel and Palestine, it's much more clear and straightforward. Stop denying Palestinians freedom. Allow them to live their own lives. Either let them have their own state on the basis of the 1967 border as you're required to under international law, or if you care so much about being in all of the land and you don't want to give any part of it to Palestinians, then you owe Palestinians equal rights. They have to be equal to Israelis in every way. And the problem is that Israel wants to have its cake and eat it too. It doesn't want to give Palestinians their own state because Israel wants to be in that land, but it doesn't want to give Palestinians equal rights in that land. They want to rule over Palestinians perpetually while denying them their rights and saying, either you live here with us without rights or you can go somewhere else. And that is the core injustice that drives the violence. And I think that that's what we should be looking at.
Final question. I know we're over time. Final question. How do we create peace? How's this all going to work out with a peaceful two-state solution, right? Is that the goal? How does it happen?
It's pretty depressing right now, I have to say. It's difficult to envision how we get there, given the extent of Israel's entrenchment of its occupation. Nearly 1 million settlers now between the West Bank and East Jerusalem. When you look at the scale of the devastation in Gaza, this kind of genocide is going to definitely create some kind of blowback. You can't get away with utterly destroying an entire people the way Israel has in Gaza and expect that then we're going to just jump to some kind of peace agreement immediately after and it's going to be fine. We are in a bleak moment, and Israel is feeling a lot of hubris right now. They are making a lot of advances in the region. They feel empowered. They have Trump now in the White House. They feel like they can essentially eliminate the Palestinian struggle for freedom once and for all. And that's precisely what they're going to try to do. So I don't think that peace is on the horizon at this moment. But I'm hoping that the real path there is to stop treating Israel like it's a country that is above the law and above the rules, to start holding them accountable, to start saying that you can't get another penny of US military funding so long as you treat Palestinians the way that you do. Once there is meaningful pressure on Israel to change its behavior, Israel will change its behavior. And that then can become the first step towards a peace agreement in whatever form that ends up taking. But that is step one, ending world and particularly US complicity in Israel's occupation of Palestine.
Well, Omar, thanks so much for the extra time here. Really appreciate it. I'll be talking to Rashid Khalidi in a few months. Maybe you can join that conversation, the author of 100 Years War in Palestine.
Great. He's absolutely terrific. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be cool if you could join that. Let me end this recording and